Hello, I'm Morgan Peckma, Editor-in-Chief of City and State, and this is City and State TV. Our guest is Bernard Kerik, the former Commissioner of the New York City Police Department. Mr. Kerik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Obviously, our viewers know about what happened in your life after you were the Commissioner of the Police Department, and now you have become, after being in prison for 3 years, you become an advocate for prison reform. Can you talk about those efforts?
Well, I think my experience in the criminal justice field, tacked on with my 3 years in the federal prison system, has given me a very unique, one-of-a-kind perspective on the system itself. And I've seen things that, one, I didn't know existed, two, that I think can be changed, and three, I think should be changed. And I think if I can accomplish anything, I think it's at least educating the American people, educating Congress, and letting them know where the flaws and failures are so that we create a debate that creates real change. The system has to change. It can't stay the way it is. It's, as the Attorney General himself, Eric Holder, says, it's unsustainable. The roads we are going down now, it's got to change. And hopefully my voice can help that happen.
Specifically, what are the foremost problems that you see with the prison system?
I think first and foremost, the mandatory minimums and sentencing guidelines are draconian. We are taking first-time nonviolent drug offenders. We're putting them in prison for years, in some cases 10 to 15 years. They get no real education or rehabilitation while they're in the system. And then we release them, and by some delusion we believe that that's going to benefit society, when in fact it's a detriment. It's an enormous detriment to society. It's an enormous cost to society. And it does not in any way help recidivism. Because these young men and women go back into society as a convicted felon. They have nowhere to go. They have no job, no real job. They can't get a job because they're now a felon. And they have to revert back to crime, some criminal activity. And thus they're going to come back into the system. In most cases, they come back to society far worse than what they went in, because prison is really, as I have tried to explain to some people that don't understand it, it's nothing but a training ground for criminal activity and thuggery. So they learn how to steal, cheat, lie, manipulate, con, gamble, fight, and then we send them home. There's no benefit to society in doing that. And I just want to make something clear. I'm not saying people shouldn't be held accountable for their actions, for making a mistake or committing a crime. Violent people that commit acts of violence, bad people that do bad things, they have to go to prison to pay for their mistakes, their crimes. But when you take young men and young women off the streets for especially first-time nonviolent offenses, and then you turn them into monsters, that's not helping society at all. And what I realized when I went to federal prison is we are doing that far more than anyone can imagine.
What about the conditions within prisons themselves? I mean, sometimes, we hear, oh, these are, country clubs, or the prisoners have cable television. I mean, what is the reality of the conditions within our prison system?
Well, I have I don't know the whole club fed, country club, perception that people have, and I think a lot of that is driven by the press and media. But I have to tell you, anytime you're deprived of your freedom, there's nothing country club about it. When you have to live out of a microwave or eat out of a Tupperware dish, or you live in a cubicle that's less than the size of the place we're sitting in right now, you have to share a shower with 30 other men. You have to share stalls, bathroom stalls with 30 other men. You have to worry about HIV and MRSA and staph infection. I promise you, that's not a country club environment. And anybody that thinks it is, they've already been institutionalized. So so that's number one. Number two, for the people out there that think, well, you shouldn't give them cable TV, and you shouldn't give them anything. In fact, as of recent, Governor Cuomo has been talking about making sure that the prisoners in the New York State system have the ability to go to college. And I've heard state legislators say, no, we shouldn't do that. Okay, well, don't do that. Don't give them anything. Turn them into far worse monsters than you're already doing already, and then send them home. It's moronic. You've got to do something. You've got to do something. And if you can get them out of the system faster, if you can get them educated, if you can teach them life improvement skills, we, society, is going to be better off. You do nothing for them, you teach them nothing, you turn them into an animal, and then you send them home. I got news for you. You have to be a moron if you think that that's the right thing to do. So, and that's a problem. One of the other things that is probably, this may be more important than anything I can say here today. We have to do something to restore the rights of a convicted felon once they've paid their debt to society. The restoration of your civil rights, your constitutional rights, is extremely important, because it then gives a convicted felon the ability to have a second chance, to really go out and live his life, promote himself or herself, to make something of themselves. Because as it stands right now today, if you're sentenced to a felony, even if you're only sentenced to a year in prison, for the rest of your natural life, you pay a collateral cost that is, it's just extremely damaging to you personally, your family, your professional career. Convicted felons are really sentenced to life, and that has to stop. I mean, the government, you can't, the Constitution says that the punishment must fit the crime. In the American criminal justice system today, that is not the case. The punishment does not fit the crime. You are punished for life for a mistake you made, and it's just not fair.
Right. I mean, we basically create the conditions whereby a prisoner cannot have gainful employment, and then we're shocked when we see recidivism, right?
Well, exactly. And I just don't think that people get it. They don't understand it. When I hear these legislators say, oh no, we shouldn't pay for their education, and we shouldn't, all these things that they don't want to do. Well, what do you want to do? What's your solution? I would say to those senators, those legislators, what is your answer then? What reduces recidivism? How are you going to make them whole? How is it going to benefit society? Because at the rate they're going, they have no answer.
Yeah, I've read you say that you didn't have a conception of how bad conditions were in prisons, and yet you were the commissioner of the New York City Department of Corrections, and the tombs were renamed in your honor. You don't,
here's the problem. A law enforcement executive, a prison administrator, you see the system from one perspective. You don't get to see the system from the inside out. You see it from the outside looking in. When I ran Rikers, we had probably the greatest achievements in the U.S. history when it comes to violence reduction and overall efficiencies within the system. It was recognized by the John F. Kennedy School of Government, recognized by the American Correctional Association, unparalleled achievements in running Rikers. But then you go into the system and live as an inmate, and you realize there's a number of things that I couldn't see from the outside looking in. There's the collateral damage to men and women, and most importantly, their families and their children. I didn't know. It didn't have, there's no way I would have known.
You know, a good friend of mine from childhood spent 8 months as an inmate in Rikers Island, and he never he never went out into the yard, because in the yard he could see his old apartment, and he just couldn't stomach the idea of being able to see his home and to not go there. What can we do to instill in lawmakers and people, you know, as the commissioner of the Department of Corrections, you didn't have a sense of what it was like to be an inmate. How can we impress that upon our policymakers so that they can grasp the real dynamics at play?
You know what, I think I just had a conversation with the executive director for the National Association of Criminal Defense criminal defense attorneys in Washington. And we had this exact same conversation, and he said to me, when he speaks about criminal justice reform, 80% of the people that he would talk to, they sort of blow him off because he's a defense attorney. With me, I've been there. I've put people in prison for a long time, but they were really bad people. They were people that tried to kill me. They were people that killed friends of mine, New York City cops. They were people that I seized tons of cocaine from, millions in drug proceeds, bad men that did bad things. Then I go to prison and I see these draconian sentences handed down to young men and young women that are just absurd. It shouldn't be happening. I think the key is to educate our law enforcement executives, to educate, and most importantly in the federal system, it's the Congress. Even the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, he is the agency head. But in reality, Congress pretty much runs the Bureau of Prisons, because you can't make any changes without some law being enacted or changed. If that's the case, Congress, one, has to be educated. Two, they have to have the courage to do their job. And that's a big part of this. That's a big problem with this, because right now our political figures are scared to death to look soft on crime. They believe, many of them, and I know many of them privately will tell me, you're right, you're 100% right. Publicly, they're never going to say that. Publicly, they will not act on a number of the things that I'm talking about, because at their next election, somebody's going to say, oh, he wants to give the inmates more incentivized good time. Yeah, well, that's a really smart thing to do, because if you give them more incentivized good time, they act better while they're in prison. Acting better while they're in prison means less violence. Less violence means less overtime. Less overtime means less sick abuse by staff. I've done this, and I had better achievements than anybody in this country when it comes to fixing a system. I know it can be fixed, and I know how to fix it. The problem is you have to educate Congress and the prison administrators and the general public to make them understand some of the things we are doing is a detriment to society.
Just this past month, we had a death in Rikers of an inmate, and I mean, I think it would be ignorant to presume that that was just purely an isolated incident. And you talked about how, as you know, as a police officer, as a law enforcement official, that you locked up bad people, but you must have some regrets about some of the conditions that people were subjected to under your watch as the head of the Department of Corrections. Or, you know, I mean, it would be nice to assume that everyone who was, you know, locked up by the police was a bad guy, but then there are incidents abound of people who were wrongfully convicted.
Well, there's a couple issues. One, it's extremely difficult. It's almost unreal. It's not reality to compare Rikers with a prison system. My average length of stay on Rikers Island was 45 to 54 days. One, there's not much rehabilitation. There's no rehabilitation you're going to give anyone within 45 to 54 days. It's not going to happen. Rikers is 80% of it is a detention facility. And the people that are there are awaiting trial. Only less than 20% at the time I was the commissioner there was sentenced prisoners, and they were sentenced for less than a year. And I had the ability as the commissioner to give them enhanced incentivized good time. I had the ability to get them out of the system faster when they deserved it, and we would do that. In a prison system is very different. When you're sentenced to prison, it's anything from a year and a day to life. So the key is, though, for any executive, any administrator, whether it's Rikers or whether it's a prison system, one, your people have to be held accountable. You have to have standards, policies that are followed. You have to have a mechanism, and this is the one thing that changed Rikers. If you look back and you remember back to 1994, I remember the cover of New York Magazine, is Rikers about to explode? We averaged almost 150 stabbings a month. We had 133,000 admissions a year. I took that number of stabbings and slashings over a 6-year period and reduced it 93%. A more substantial reduction in violence than anyone in the country. Over the last 6 to 8 years, Rikers has begun to return to its old ways. You've had this recent incident with the former Marine that died. You had an incident where you had correction officers actually overseeing the beating death of another inmate. You've had riots in some of the dormitories. That violence comes from a lack of leadership and a lack of accountability. And I can't say what's going on. I can only judge from the outside looking at the activity that's happened. Somebody has to get on top of it. And I know the Mayor de Blasio just appointed a new commissioner who I'm sure is going to look at this and take some action, because if he doesn't, the violence is going to continue to grow. And they have less inmates today. They have far less inmates than I did. So it has to change.
From a philosophical standpoint, or at least from our country's philosophical standpoint, and how we approach prison policy, I mean, isn't the term corrections itself a misnomer, because our prison system doesn't aim anymore to rehabilitate prisoners, but merely to punish them?
And you know what? That's exactly where the problem is. I believed, especially in the federal system, that we pay taxes for two things: incarcerating bad people and rehabilitating people. I've come to find out we pay taxes for one thing: to warehouse human beings. That's what we're paying taxes for. Some of them may be bad people, but I promise you, there's a lot of really good people that made mistakes that are sitting in prison when they don't need to be. They could be punished by alternative sentences. They could be punished with more severe fines or penalties. They could be punished with community service. I would much rather give somebody community service, if we could, give them an alternative sentence, have them paying taxes, taking care of their families, looking after their children, and creating better relationships with their children. You cannot parent a child in absentia. You can't do it. And we put people in prison for some of these low-level, first-time nonviolent offenses. We separate them from their children, and then we wonder why their children wind up in prison behind them. You know, the system as it stands today contradicts its own mission statement. We're not rehabilitating in reality. Anybody that comes out of the federal prison system today that we can look at and say that person really was rehabilitated, they did it on their own.
Last year I interviewed Jack Abramoff, who has since become an advocate for reforming our lobbying practices, and the criticism of him, in his post-prison work has often been that this is a guy who's trying to profiteer off his experience because he has no other options. He can't go back to his old life. And so now his only play is to be the flip side. I feel like that is something that could be leveled against you as well. How would you respond to that criticism?
Take it from what it's worth. I get no benefit out of this. I'm not getting paid to talk to you, and I haven't been paid to do any speeches concerning this. It's all been done on my own time. It doesn't benefit my sentence. It's not helping me at all. I'm not looking to make money off of prison reform. If I could, that would be nice. You know, I heard somebody talk about Jack Abramoff one time, and they said, you know, he wrote a book, and he's going to sell his book to pay off his restitution. He'd have to sell more books than the Bible. It's not the case. And I can't speak for him, but what I can say is, in the area of criminal justice reform, nobody in this country, as it stands today, has ever been in the system with my background and experience. No one. That gives me a very unique perspective. Take it or leave it. Listen, don't listen. I know how the system works. I know what it's supposed to accomplish, and I know how to fix it. The system can be fixed. You can listen to me or not listen to me. Eventually, you're going to fix the system because it's unsustainable the way it is. So if I can help accomplish that, fine. If not, go figure out another way to do it. But eventually you're going to do it because it's going to erupt and explode.
Bernard Kerik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, sir.